So one of the most beautiful and wondrous things about Oliver Sacks's mind, which is also one of the most beautiful and wondrous things about his books, because he wrote the way he thought, or rather wrote in order to think as a form of thinking, was that every single subject he took up became constellated with all of these connections to other minds and other fields and other eras. And he would draw on the work of composers and poets and artists to illustrate his scientific subjects. And in this kind of splendor of associations, I've discovered many times remarkable books that I would have never come across were it not for a footnote or a passing mention in one of Oliver's books, because I like to think of literature as the original internet, and his literature was strewn with hyperlinks to other literature. And one such footnote a long time ago in one of his books led me to another book, which led me in turn to somebody that I really fell in love with and came to see as a kindred spirit to Oliver in many ways, the marine biologist and writer Rachel Carson, whose 1962 book Silent Spring catalyzed the environmental movement. Like Oliver, she was an incredibly poetic writer, but also a trained scientist who wrote about science in a completely new way at the time. This was half a century ago. And she just had this beautiful, elegant prose that pioneered a new aesthetic of science writing. Like Oliver, she loved poetry, she loved classical music, and was this sensitive, introverted intellect that seemed somewhat out of time and out of place in her own era, so that a friend of hers later said that she seemed to have something of the 19th century in her, which, as we just saw, was very much true of Oliver as well. So I'm going to preface what I'm going to read from The River of Consciousness, the new collection of Oliver's essays, with something that Rachel Carson wrote to Dorothy Freeman, who was the love of her life and the closest thing she ever had to a partner, because she lived in an era bereft of the luxury that those of us who are queer today have of living out our loves. So this is from a letter that she wrote to Dorothy, and I'd like to dedicate it to Billy Hayes, who will read after me. If you have read Oliver's memoir On the Move, which you absolutely must, you will know why. So this is Rachel Carson. I don't suppose anyone really knows how a creative writer works, he or she least of all perhaps, or what sort of nourishment his spirit must have. All I am certain of is this, that it is quite necessary for me to know that there is someone who is deeply devoted to me as a person, and who also has the capacity and the depth of understanding to share vicariously the sometimes crushing burden of creative effort, recognizing the heartache, the great weariness of mind and body, the occasional black despair it may involve, someone who cherishes me and what I'm trying to create as well. And then, my dear one, you came into my life. I feel such a joyous surge of wonder every time I stop to think how in such a dark time and when I least expected it, something so lovely and richly satisfying came into my life. And now, from The River of Consciousness, these are selections from The Creative Self by Oliver Sacks. All children indulge in play, at once repetitive and imitative, and equally exploratory and innovative. They are drawn both to the familiar and the usual, grounding and anchoring themselves in what is known and secure, and to what is new and has never been experienced. Children have an elemental hunger for knowledge and understanding, for mental food and stimulation. They do not need to be told or motivated to explore or play, for play, like all creative or proto-creative activities, is deeply pleasurable in itself. Both the innovative and the imitative impulses come together in pretend play, often using toys or dolls or miniature replicas of real-world objects to act out new scenarios or rehearse and replay old ones. Voracious assimilation, imitating various models, while not creative in itself, is often the harbinger of future creativity. Art, music, film, and literature, no less than the facts and information, can provide a special sort of education, what Arnold Weinstein calls a vicarious immersion in others' lives, endowing us with new eyes and ears. For my generation, this immersion came mostly from reading, and Susan Sontag, at a conference in 2002, spoke about how reading opened up an entire world to her when she was quite young, enlarging her imagination and memory far beyond the bounds of her actual, immediate personal experience. She recalled, "When I was 5 or 6, I read Eve Curie's biography of her mother. I read comic books, dictionaries, and encyclopedias indiscriminately, and with great pleasure. It felt like the more I took in, the stronger I was, the bigger the world got. I think I was, from the very beginning, an incredibly gifted student, an incredibly gifted learner, a champion child autodidact. Is that creative? No, it wasn't creative, but it didn't preclude becoming creative later on. I was engorging rather than making. I was a mental traveler, a mental glutton. My childhood, apart from my wretched actual life, was just a career in ecstasy." She assimilated a huge knowledge of other times and places, of the varieties of human nature and experience, and these perspectives played a huge part in inciting her to write herself. What is especially striking about Sontag's account, and similar accounts of proto-creativity, is the energy, the ravenous passion, the enthusiasm, the love with which the young mind turns to whatever will nourish it, seeks intellectual or other models, and hones its skills by imitation. Quoting Sontag again, "I started writing when I was about 7. I started a newspaper when I was 8, which I filled with stories and poems and plays and articles, and which I used to sell to the neighbors for 5 cents. I'm sure it was quite banal and conventional, and simply made up of things influenced by things I was reading. Of course, there were models, there was a pantheon of those people. If I was reading the stories of Poe, then I would write a Poe-like story. When I was 10, a long-forgotten play about robots fell into my hands, so I wrote a play about robots. But it was absolutely derivative. Whatever I saw, I loved, and whatever I loved, I wanted to imitate. That's not necessarily the royal road to real innovation and creativity. Neither as I saw it does it preclude it. I started to be a real writer at 13. Sontag's prodigious and precocious intelligence and creativity allowed her to leapfrog into real writing as a teenager, but for most people, the period of imitation and apprenticeship, studenthood, lasts much longer. It is a time when one struggles to find one's powers, one's own voice. It is a time of practice, repetition, imitation, of mastering and perfecting skills and techniques. Some people, having undergone such an apprenticeship, may remain at the level of technical mastery without ever ascending to major creativity. And it may be difficult to judge, even at a distance, when the leap from talented but derivative work to major innovation has occurred. Where does one draw the line between influence and imitation? What distinguishes creative assimilation, a deep intertwining of appropriation and experience, from mere mimicry? The term mimicry may imply a certain consciousness or intention, but imitating, echoing, or mirrorage are universal psychological and indeed physiological propensities that can be seen in every human being and many animals, hence the term parroting or aping. If imitation plays a central role in the performing arts, where incessant practice, repetition, and rehearsal are essential, it is equally important in painting or composing or writing, for example. All young artists seek models in their apprentice years, models whose style, technical mastery, and innovations can teach them. Young painters may haunt the galleries of the Met or the Louvre. Young composers may go to concerts or study scores. All art, in this sense, start out as derivative, highly influenced by, if not a direct imitation or paraphrase of, the admired and emulated models. When Alexander Pope was 13 years old, he asked the older poet, William Walsh, whom he admired, for advice. Walsh's advice was to be correct. Pope took this to mean that he should first gain a mastery of poetic forms and techniques so that he would have a vehicle for his own perceptions and feelings and ideas. To this end, Pope, in his Imitations of English Poets, began by imitating Walsh, then Cowley, then the Earl of Rochester, then more major figures like Chaucer and Spenser, as well as paraphrases, as he called them, of Latin poets. By 17, he had mastered the heroic couplet and wrote his pastorals and other poems, where he developed and honed his own style while contenting himself with the most insipid or cliched content. It was only once he had established full mastery of his style and form that he started to charge it with content, the exquisite and sometimes terrifying products of his own imagination. For most artists, perhaps, these stages or processes overlap a good deal, but imitation and mastery of form or skills must come before major creativity. Yet, even with years of preparation and conscious mastery, great talent may not fulfill its seeming promise. Footnote. In his autobiography, Ex-Prodigy, Norbert Wiener, who entered Harvard at 14 to get his doctorate and remained a prodigy all his life, describes a contemporary of his, William James Sidis. Sidis, named after his godfather, William James, was a brilliant polyglot mathematician who enrolled at Harvard at the age of 11, but by 16, perhaps overwhelmed by the demands of his genius and of society, he had given up mathematics and retreated from public and academic life. Many creators, whether they are artists, scientists, cooks, teachers, or engineers, may be content, after they have achieved a level of mastery, to stay with a form or play with its bounds for the rest of their lives, never breaking into anything radically new. Their work may remain at the level of the formulaic, the reproductive, the derivative, but still show mastery and even virtuosity, giving great delight even if it does not take the further step into major creativity. There are many examples of minor creativity that does not seem to change much in character after its initial expression. Arthur Conan Doyle's 1887 A Study in Scarlet, the first of the Sherlock Holmes books, was a remarkable achievement. There had never been a detective story like it before. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, 5 years later, was an enormous success, and Conan Doyle found himself the acclaimed writer of a potentially never-ending series. He was delighted by this, but also annoyed because he wanted to write historical novels too, but the public showed little interest in these. They wanted Holmes and more Holmes, and he had to supply it. Even after he killed Holmes off in The Final Problem, sending him to the Rhinebeck Falls in mortal combat with Moriarty, the public insisted that he be resurrected. And so he was, in 1905, in The Return of Sherlock Holmes. There is not much development in Holmes's method or mind or character. He does not seem to age. Between cases, Holmes himself scarcely exists, or rather, exists in a regressed state, scraping at his violin, shooting up cocaine, doing malodorous chemical experiments, until he is summoned to action by the next case. The stories of the 1920s have been written in the 1890s, could have been written in the 1890s, and those written in the 1890s could not have been out of place later. Holmes's London is as unchanging as the man. Both are depicted brilliantly, once and for all. In the 1890s, Doyle himself, in his 1928 preface to Sherlock Holmes' Complete Short Stories, says that the reader may read the stories in any order. Why is it that out of every 100 gifted young musicians who study at Juilliard, or every 100 brilliant young scientists who go to work in major labs under illustrious mentors, only a handful will write memorable musical compositions or make scientific discoveries of major importance? Are the majority, despite their gifts, lacking in some further creative spark? Are they missing characteristics other than creativity which may be essential for creative achievement, such as boldness, confidence, independence of mind? It takes a special energy over and above one's creative potential, a special audacity or subversiveness to strike out in a new direction once one is settled. It is a gamble, as all creative projects must be, for the new direction may not turn out to be productive at all. Creativity involves not only years of conscious preparation and training, but unconscious preparation as well. This incubation period is essential to allow the subconscious assimilation and incorporation of one's influences and sources, to reorganize and synthesize them into something of one's own. In Wagner's overture to Rienzi, one can almost trace this emergence. There are echoes, imitations, paraphrases, pastiches of Rossini, Meyerbeer, Schumann, and others, all the musical influences of his apprenticeship. And then, suddenly, astoundingly, one hears Wagner's own voice, powerful, extraordinary, though to my mind horrible, a voice of genius without precedent or antecedent. The essential element in these realms of retaining and appropriating versus assimilating and incorporating is one of depth, of meaning, of active and personal involvement. Early in 1982, I received an unexpected packet from London containing a letter from Harold Pinter and the manuscript of a new play, A Kind of Alaska, which, he said, had been inspired by a case history of mine in Awakenings. In his letter, Pinter said that he had read my book when it originally came out in 1973 and had immediately wondered about the problems presented by a dramatic adaptation of this. But seeing no ready solution to these problems, he had then forgotten about it. One morning, 8 years later, Pinter wrote, he had awoken with the first image and first words, "Something is happening," clear and pressing in his mind. The play had then written itself in the days and weeks that followed. I could not help contrasting this with a play inspired by the same case history, which I had been sent 4 years earlier, where the author, in an accompanying letter, said that he had read Awakenings 2 months before and had been so influenced, so possessed by it, that he felt impelled to write a play straight away. Whereas I love Pinter's play, not least because it effected so profound a transformation, a Pinterization of my own themes, I felt that the 1978 play to be grossly derivative, for it lifted, sometimes, whole sentences out of my book without transforming them in the least. It seemed to me less an original play than a plagiarism or a parody, yet there was no doubting the author's obsession or good faith. I was not sure what to make of this. Was the author too lazy or too lacking in talent or originality to make the needed transformation of my work? Or was the problem essentially one of incubation, that he had not allowed himself enough time for the experience of reading Awakenings to sink in, nor had he allowed himself, as Pinter did, time to forget it, to let it fall into his unconscious, where it might link with other experiences and thoughts. All of us, to some extent, borrow from others, from the culture around us. Ideas are in the air, and we may appropriate, often without realizing, the phrases and language of the times. We borrow language itself. We did not invent it. We found it. We grew up into it, thought we may use it, interpret it in very individual ways. What is at issue is not the fact of borrowing or imitating, of being derivative, being influenced, but what one does with what is borrowed or imitated or derived. How deeply one assimilates it, takes it into oneself, compounds it with one's own experiences and thoughts and feelings, places it in relation to oneself, and expresses it in a new way, one's own. Time, forgetting, and incubation are equally essential before deep scientific or mathematical insights can be achieved. Henri Poincaré, the great mathematician, recounts in his autobiography how he wrestled with a particularly difficult mathematical problem, but getting nowhere, became deeply frustrated. He decided to take a break by going on a geological excursion, and this travel distracted him from the mathematical problem. One day, though, he wrote, "We entered an omnibus to go someplace or other. At the moment when I put my foot on the step, the idea came to me without anything in my former thoughts seeming to have paved the way for it, that the transformations I had used to define diffusion functions were identical with those of non-Euclidean geometry. I did not verify the idea. I should not have had the time. As I went on, with a conversation already commenced, but I felt a perfect certainty. On my return to Caen, my conscience sake, I verified the results at my leisure." It seemed clear, as Poincaré wrote, that there must be an active and intense unconscious or subconscious or preconscious activity even during the period when a problem is lost to conscious thought and the mind is empty or distracted with other things. This is not the dynamic or Freudian unconscious, boiling with repressed fears and desires, nor the cognitive unconscious, which enables one to drive a car or to utter a grammatical sentence with no conscious idea of how one does it. It is instead the incubation of hugely complex problems performed by an entire hidden creative self. Poincaré pays tribute to this unconscious self. It is not purely automatic, it is capable of discernment, it knows how to choose to divine. It knows better how to divine than the conscious self, since it succeeds where that has failed. The sudden uprush of a solution to a long-incubated problem may sometimes occur in dreams, or states of partial consciousness, such as one tends to experience immediately before falling asleep or immediately after waking, with the strange freedom of thought and sometimes almost hallucinatory images that come at such times. Wagner gives a vivid description of how the orchestral introduction to Das Ringgold came to him after long waiting, when he too was in a strange quasi-hallucinatory twilight state. Quoting Wagner, "After a night spent in fever and sleeplessness, I forced myself to take a long tramp the next day through the hilly country, which was covered with pine woods. Returning in the afternoon, I stretched myself, dead tired, on a hard couch. I fell into a kind of somnolent state, in which I suddenly felt as though I were sinking in swiftly flowing water. The rushing sound formed itself in my brain into a musical sound, the chord of E-flat major, which continued re-echoed in broken forms. These broken forms seemed to be melodic passages of increased motion, yet the pure triad of E-flat major never changed, but seemed by its continuance to impart infinite significance to the element in which I was sinking. I at once recognized that the orchestral overture to the Rheingold, which must have long lain latent within me, had at last been revealed to me." Creativity, that state when ideas seem to organize themselves into a swift, tightly woven flow with a feeling of gorgeous clarity and meaning emerging, seems to me physiologically distinctive, and I think that if we had the ability to make fine enough brain images, these would show an unusual and widespread activity with innumerable connections and synchronizations occurring. At such times, when I am myself writing, thoughts seem to organize themselves in spontaneous succession and to clothe themselves incessantly in appropriate words. I feel I can bypass or transcend much of my own personality, my neuroses. It is at once not me and the innermost part of me, certainly the best part of me. Thank you.
Thank you. Oliver Sacks. Among many other things, Oliver Sacks was a man of multiple enthusiasms for ferns, cycads, cephalopods, minerals, metals, motorbikes, swimming, smoked salmon, fresh herring, Charles Darwin, and Bach, to name a few. But none more so than for words. When I say he loved words, I don't simply mean within the context of being a writer of numerous now classic books. Even if he had never written a single one, I'm sure Oliver would still have been that funny fellow who took giant dictionaries to bed for light reading, aided by a magnifying glass. He delighted in etymology, synonyms, antonyms, slang, swear words, palindromes, anatomical terms, neologisms, but objected in principle to contractions. He could joyfully parse the difference between homonyms and homophones, not to mention homographs, in dinner table conversation. He also kind of relished saying those three words aloud, that lovely, breathy H alliteration. "Every day a word surprises me," he once commented, beaming, apropos of nothing other than that a word had suddenly popped into his head. I used to call Oliver a walking OED, Oxford English Dictionary, because he could recall spellings and definitions so accurately. And yet he remained modest, never flaunting his extraordinary vocabulary, and always deferring to a dictionary for confirmation, if in doubt. Oliver loved words so much, he often dreamed of them, and he sometimes dreamed them up. One morning, one unforgettable morning 5 years ago, I found a phrase he'd written on the dry erase whiteboard in the kitchen. All it said was, 5 a.m., nephalopsia. What the hell does that mean? I said while I was making coffee. Oliver chuckled, and then he went on to describe an elaborate dream he'd had that night in which he was stuck on an alien planet where anthropomorphic clouds turned menacing and murderously tipped over the Land Rover he was driving. A cloud nightmare, he added, as if it were hardly his first. He had written this note upon waking at 5 a.m. so as not to forget it. And this was not unusual. He would report his dreams to his Freudian psychoanalyst, who he saw twice a week for 4 decades. Oliver told me that nephalopsia either means seeing clouds or being enveloped by clouds. But then his brow furrowed. Wait a minute. Now he wasn't so sure. Let's look it up in the good book, he said, and together we proceeded straight to the OED. There we found variations on nephology, meaning the study of clouds, but no nephalopsia. Turns out he'd accidentally coined the word. We laughed about this, but in fact it wasn't the first time. Oliver made up the term musicophilia, meaning an intense love of music, which hadn't existed before he came up with the title for his 2007 book. But he was always very quick to point out that musicophobia, a hatred or fear of music, had long been part of the English language. And he felt that musicophobia appreciated his invention. Now it has an antonym, he observed. It was this love of words and the act of writing, which he considered a form of thinking, that moved Oliver to tell me one day, shortly after I'd moved to New York, "You must keep a journal." This was not a suggestion, but an instruction. I nodded and thought to myself, I must. So I followed his advice straight away, writing that exchange down on a scrap of paper, which I still have to this day. My New York journal grew and grew as the years passed, up to 700 pages, but I never reread it until the time came when I decided to write a memoir about my life in New York and my life with Oliver, which I later titled Insomniac City. I thought reading it would just jog my memory, but instead I found something truly surprising. Parts of the book had already been written, in a sense. Scenes and stretches of dialogue between O and me I'd jotted down, as if they'd been quietly waiting for me to hear them again. I'm sure this would not have surprised Oliver in the least. So many of his own books had their genesis in notes he made in journals, including the new book, The River of Consciousness. The River of Consciousness is a collection of 10 essays personally picked by Oliver just 2 weeks before he died. They all have themes of science. There are 2 dazzling pieces on Charles Darwin, a piece on Freud. You heard Maria read the wonderful piece on creativity, memory, time, the history of ideas. And I'm going to read from one of my favorite pieces, and it was one of Oliver's favorites as well, and it's called Mishearings. But before I begin, I'm just going to give you a little bit of context. Oliver received his cancer diagnosis in mid-January 2015. And his immediate impulse was to write. Within days, a matter of days, he'd completed the now classic essay, My Own Life, which was later, a few weeks later, published in the New York Times. He then plunged right into working on final edits for his autobiography, On the Move, which would be published in the spring. He had to have a surgery in February, and the day he got home from the hospital, after 10 days in the hospital, he began thinking and working on a new piece. A piece that's kind of the flip side of My Own Life. My Own Life is about accepting the diagnosis, facing his own mortality, and feeling a sense of gratitude for the life he'd led. The new piece, which is called A General Feeling of Disorder, and is also in this book, is really about the experience of being a patient, of having had surgery, recovering, fascinated and grateful to his body, and about convalescence. He next completed a major case history on the tragic story of the performer Spalding Gray, which ends with his suicide. This is a piece that Oliver had been thinking about and worked on very hard for many weeks, and it was a difficult piece and kind of draining, sad. It was later published in The New Yorker. And after this, he was ready for something lighter in tone. He wanted to have some fun. So he turned to a subject he'd been thinking about for a long time and making notes about in journals: mishearing. As he grew older, he grew quite deaf, and those of us who were around him, his staff, friends, family, almost got used to the fact that Oliver, who did wear hearing aids sometimes, often would mishear what we said. But so typical of Oliver Sacks, instead of seeing this as a disability, to him it was just a change. Not something he got upset about, or irritated, or exasperated, or embarrassed, but for him, a new subject of inquiry, and really even of humor. So, with no further ado, I'm going to read from Mishearings. This is a piece, too, that Oliver himself really enjoyed reading to friends. A few weeks ago, when I heard my friend Kate say to me, "I'm going to choir practice," I was surprised. I have never, in the 30 years we've known each other, heard her express the slightest interest in singing. But I thought, who knows? Perhaps this is a part of herself she's kept quiet about. Perhaps it's a new interest. Perhaps her son is in a choir. Perhaps I was fertile with hypotheses. But I did not consider for a moment that I had misheard her. It was only on her return that I found she had been to the chiropractor. A few days later, Kate jokingly said, "Oliver, I'm off to choir practice." Again, I was baffled. Firecrackers? Why was Kate talking about firecrackers? As my deafness increases, I'm more and more prone to mishearing what people say, though this is quite unpredictable. It may happen 20 times or not at all in the course of a day. I carefully record these in a little red notebook labeled paracuses, which means alterations in hearing, especially mishearings. So I enter what I hear in a red pen on one page, what was actually said in green pen on the opposite page, and in purple, people's reactions to my mishearings, and the often far-fetched hypotheses I may consider in an attempt to make sense of what is essentially nonsensical. After the publication of Freud's Psychopathology of Everyday Life in 1901, such mishearings, along with a range of misreadings, misspeakings, and slips of the tongue, were seen as Freudian, an expression of deeply repressed feelings and conflicts. But although there are occasional unprintable mishearings that make me blush, the vast majority do not admit any simple Freudian interpretation. In almost all of my mishearings, however, there is a similar overall sound, a similar acoustic gestalt, linking what is said and what is heard. Syntax is always preserved, but this does not help. Mishearings are likely to capsize meaning, to overwhelm it with phonologically similar but meaningless or absurd sound forms, even though the general form of a sentence is preserved. Lack of clear enunciation or unusual accents can all serve to mislead one's own perceptions. Most mishearings substitute one real word for another, however absurd or out of context, but sometimes the brain comes up with a neologism. When a friend told me on the phone that her child was sick, I misheard tonsillitis as pontillitis, and I was puzzled. Was this some unusual clinical syndrome, an inflammation I'd never heard of? It did not occur to me that I had invented a non-existent word, indeed, a non-existent condition. Every mishearing is a novel concoction. The 100th is as fresh and as surprising as the first. I'm often surprisingly slow to realize that I have misheard, and I may entertain the most elaborate ideas to explain my mishearings, when it would seem that I should spot them straight away. If a mishearing seems plausible, one may not think one has misheard. It is only if the mishearing is sufficiently implausible or entirely out of context that one thinks, this can't be right, and perhaps asks the speaker to repeat himself, as I often do. When Kate spoke of going to choir practice, I accepted this. She could have been going to choir practice. But on the other hand, when a friend spoke one day about a big-time cuttlefish diagnosed with ALS, I felt I must be mishearing. Now, cephalopods do have elaborate nervous systems. It's true, and Oliver Sacks would know that. And perhaps, I thought for a split second, I guess a cuttlefish could have ALS. But it was the idea of a big-time cuttlefish. That was the tip-off. It turned out to be a big-time publicist. The nature of perception in every sense, interested Oliver very much. It's a theme that runs throughout his whole work. But this is expressed especially beautifully in the title essay of the collection, The River of Consciousness. Here in this piece, he takes on a big question. What is consciousness? Why are humans sentient, aware, and conscious, unlike other animals? And how do you describe it? The piece is gorgeous, but I'm going to finish with just a short closing passage. In it, he brings the question down to, or back to, really, the personal, the individual, which is another theme present throughout his work, expressed especially eloquently in that first New York Times essay, My Own Life, where he wrote that beautiful line, "It is the fate, the genetic and neural fate of every human being to be a unique individual." So now the closing of The River of Consciousness. Picture Oliver Sacks. As I write this, I'm sitting at a cafe on 7th Avenue, watching the world go by. My attention and focus dart to and fro. I see a girl in a red dress, a man with a funny dog, the sun at last emerging from behind the clouds. But there are also other sensations that seem to come by themselves. The noise of a car backfiring, the smell of cigarette smoke as an upwind neighbor lights up. These are all events which catch my attention for a moment as they happen. Why, out of 1,000 possible perceptions, are these the ones I seize upon? Reflections, memories, associations lie behind them. For consciousness is always active and selective, charged with feelings and meanings uniquely our own, informing our choices and interfusing our perceptions. So it is not just 7th Avenue that I see, but my 7th Avenue, marked by my own selfhood and identity. Christopher Isherwood starts his story, A Berlin Diary, with an extended photographic metaphor. I am a camera with its shutter open, quite passive, recording, not thinking, he writes. But we deceive ourselves if we imagine that we can ever be passive, impartial observers. Every perception, every scene is shaped by us, whether we intend it or know it or not. We are the directors of the film we are making, but we are its subjects too. Every frame, every moment is us, is ours. Thank you.
Hi. I'm going to do a kind of a combined reading, a reading within a reading. I'm going to read from something I wrote about Oliver just after he died in 2015. And within it, I talk about I'm explaining one of his essays, and I'm going to read from that as well, his famous essay, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. 4 weeks before Oliver Sacks died, I received a letter from him. In our all-too-brief correspondence, he never emailed. He wrote beautiful, longhand letters on heavy, cream-colored stationery with a blue fountain pen, the script slanting to the left. They were always peppered with cross-outs and insertions that gave a glimpse of his overflowing mind. I'm writing a piece on eyes, all sorts, from those of jellyfish and scallops and jumping spiders and octopi to our vertebrate eyes, he reported. I'm also trying to write something about the deadly effects of social media when they absorb people to the exclusion of everything else throughout their waking hours. He told me of his delight in coming upon a century-old E.M. Forster short story called The Machine Stops. Do you know it, he asked. Forster, he said, had foreseen such possibilities. But I don't know if I can complete the pieces, he went on. I fear I'm losing ground fast. He was having trouble breathing and was growing weaker. No one taught me more about how to be a doctor than Oliver Sacks. I first encountered his writing during medical school when I picked up his classic collection, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. The stories in the book were more than a decade old by then, ancient history in medical science, but Sacks's voice was already timeless. He told simply of a few patients he had seen and their unusual neurological conditions. But he did so with the sort of inquisitiveness and observational power that I, as a young doctor-to-be, could not help but want to emulate. He captured both the medical and the human drama of illness and the task of the clinician observing it. So let me read the opening of the famous title story. From The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Dr. P was a musician of distinction, well known for many years as a singer, and then at the local school of music as a teacher. It was here, in relation to his students, that certain strange problems were first observed. Sometimes a student would present himself, and Dr. P would not recognize him, or specifically, would not recognize his face. The moment the student spoke, he would be recognized by his voice. Such incidents multiplied, causing embarrassment, perplexity, fear, and sometimes comedy. For not only did Dr. P increasingly fail to see faces, but he saw faces when there were no faces to see. Genially, Magoo-like, when in the street he might pat the heads of water hydrants and parking meters, taking them to be the heads of children. He would amiably address carved knobs on the furniture and be astounded when they did not reply. At first, these odd mistakes were laughed off as jokes, not least by Dr. P himself. Had he not always had a quirky sense of humor and been given to Zen-like paradoxes? His musical powers were as dazzling as ever. He did not feel ill. He had never felt better. And the mistakes were so ludicrous and so ingenious that they could hardly be serious or betoken anything serious. The notion of there being something the matter did not emerge until some 3 years later, when diabetes developed. Well aware that diabetes could affect his eyes, Dr. P consulted an ophthalmologist who took a careful history and examined his eyes closely. "There's nothing the matter with your eyes," the doctor concluded, "but there is trouble with the visual parts of your brain. You don't need my help. You must see a neurologist." And so, as a result of this referral, Dr. P came to me. Sachs was unendingly curious, and I, like millions of readers, eagerly followed him on his explorations into why music moves human beings, what it's like to have amnesia or autism or drug-induced hallucinations. What was wrong with this man who could not recognize faces? Dr. P was a puzzle, and Sachs regarded him with unapologetic fascination. And so did we all. It could make me uncomfortable at times. Sachs observed his subjects with a naturalist's dispassion, and when his descriptions made me laugh or gasp or turn the page to find out more about the person's predicament, I felt complicit. To continue reading. It was obvious within a few seconds of meeting Dr. P that there was no trace of dementia in the ordinary sense. He was a man of great cultivation and charm, who talked well and fluently, with imagination and humor. I couldn't think why he had been referred to our clinic, and yet there was something a bit odd. He faced me as he spoke, was oriented towards me, and yet there was something the matter. It was difficult to formulate. He faced me with his ears, I came to think, not with his eyes. These, instead of looking, gazing at me, taking me in the normal way, made sudden strange fixations on my nose, on my right ear, down to my chin, up to my right eye, as if noting, even studying, these individual features, but not seeing my whole face, its changing expressions, me as a whole. I'm not sure that I fully realized this at the time. There was just a teasing strangeness, some failure in the normal interplay of gaze and expression. He saw me, he scanned me, and yet, well, what seems to be the matter? I asked him at length. Nothing I know of, he replied with a smile, but people seem to think there's something wrong with my eyes. But you don't recognize any visual problems? No, not directly, but I occasionally make mistakes. I left the room briefly to talk to his wife. When I came back, Dr. P was sitting placidly by the window, attentive, listening rather than looking out. Traffic, he said, street sounds, distant trains. They make a sort of symphony, do they not? You know Honegger's Pacific 234? What a lovely man, I thought to myself. How can there be anything seriously the matter? Would he permit me to examine him? Yes, of course, Dr. Sachs. I stilled my disquiet, his perhaps too, in the soothing routine of a neurological exam, muscle strength, coordination, reflexes, tone. It was while examining his reflexes, a trifle abnormal on the left side, that the first bizarre experience occurred. I had taken off his left shoe and scratched the sole of his foot with a key, a frivolous-seeming but essential test of a reflex, and then excusing myself to screw my ophthalmoscope together, left him to put on the shoe himself. To my surprise, a minute later, he had not done this. Can I help? I asked. Help what? Help whom? Help you put on your shoe. Ach, he said, I'd forgotten the shoe, adding sotto voce, the shoe. The shoe? He seemed baffled. Your shoe, I repeated. Perhaps you'd put it on? He continued to look downwards, though not at the shoe, with an intense but misplaced concentration. Finally, his gaze settled on his foot. That is my shoe, yes? Did I mishear? Did I missee? My eyes, he explained, and put a hand to his foot. This is my shoe, no? No, it is not. That is your foot. There is your shoe. Ah, I thought that was my foot. Was he joking? Was he mad? Was he blind? If this was one of his strange mistakes, it was the strangest mistake I'd ever come across. I helped him on with his shoe, his foot, to avoid further complication. Dr. P himself seemed untroubled, indifferent, maybe amused. I resumed my examination. His visual acuity was good. He had no difficulty seeing a pin on the floor, though sometimes he missed it if it was placed to his left. He saw all right, but what did he see? I opened out a copy of the National Geographic magazine and asked him to describe some pictures in it. His responses here were very curious. His eyes would dart from one thing to another, picking up tiny features, individual features, as they had done with my face. A striking brightness, a color, a shape would arrest his attention and elicit comment, but in no case did he see the scene as a whole. He failed to see the whole, seeing only details, which he spotted like blips on a radar screen. He never entered into relation with the picture as a whole, never faced, so to speak, its physiognomy. He had no sense whatever of a landscape or a scene. I showed him the cover, an unbroken expanse of Sahara dunes. What do you see here? I asked. I see a river, he said, and a little guest house with its terrace on the water. People are dining out on the terrace. I see colored parasols here and there. He was looking, if it was looking, right off the cover, into midair, and confabulating non-existent features, as if the absence of the features in the actual picture had driven him to imagine the river and the terrace and the colored parasols. I must have looked aghast, but he seemed to think he had done rather well. There was a hint of a smile on his face. He also appeared to have decided that the examination was over and started to look around for his hat. He reached out his hand and took hold of his wife's head, tried to lift it off to put it on. He'd apparently mistaken his wife for a hat. His wife looked as if she was used to such things. As a student, I wanted my unabashed enthrallment to be redeemed by an account of how Sacks's often decidedly personal investigations resulted in a solution, a treatment. But mostly they didn't. His careful observations of Dr. P gradually led to the conclusion that he had a disease that caused severe damage to the areas of the brain that process visual information. Nothing could be done about it. The disease advanced inexorably until Dr. P's death. But it was still essential, Sacks wanted us to know, simply to understand. This, I think, was his deepest lesson. His most important role as a doctor and as a writer was to bear witness to the wide experience of being human. There was a tender passion beneath the dispassion. Studies, yes, he wrote in the preface, but why stories or cases? Because, he explained, the understanding of disease cannot be separated from the understanding of the person. They're interwoven, and this has been forgotten in our era of scans, tests, genetics, and procedures. He compared the modern clinical practitioner to the man who mistook his wife for a hat, able to register many details, yet still miss the person entirely. To restore the human subject at the center, the suffering, afflicted, fighting human subject, we must deepen a case history to a narrative or a tale, he wrote. I got to meet Sacks just twice. The first time was in 2002 when, as a surgical resident and a fledgling writer for the New Yorker magazine, I went to hear him speak at the New Yorker Festival. He had a reputation for being introverted, awkward, but on stage he was warm and funny and less purely cerebral than I expected. He was the same way when I spoke to him afterwards. He'd read my essays, I was surprised to learn, and he asked me about an idea from one that had stuck with him. I don't remember the subject now. I do remember the shift in me that came from our brief conversation. Up to that point, I'd regarded writing as a lucky sideline to my surgical career and hardly felt like someone who deserved to call himself a writer. But because Sacks seemed to be holding my work to a higher standard, I realized that I needed to as well. The second occasion was in March 2014 when Sacks came to a lecture I was giving here in New York at Rockefeller University. He was 80 then and walked with a cane, but he was only physically slowed. During our long conversation afterwards, he told me about the memoir he was just finishing, which would be called On the Move. I told him about the book on aging and dying that I was finishing. We sent each other our manuscripts and entered into a correspondence. Later, he learned that a rare cancer, which had been treated 9 years earlier, had returned and was spreading throughout his body. He made the news public that February in the Times essay Billy spoke of, in what became the first of 4 extraordinary essays in which he turned his unflinching powers of observation to his own condition. Now I'm face to face with dying, he wrote. The cancer occupies 1/3 of my liver, and though its advance may be slowed, this particular sort of cancer cannot be halted. A month later, he sent me a letter. He'd just undergone a catheter procedure that delivered chemotherapy and clot-inducing particles directly into his liver in the hope of reducing its load of metastases. I feel awful now, but a little better every day, he said. He was, as ever, looking forward to getting back to writing, and he managed to keep his writing going right to his final days. In the last letter I received from him, he admitted to being tempted to think in pessimistic, even apocalyptic terms. But he was held back, he said, by the thought of the people who would continue after him. Good scientists, good physicians, etc., who give me hope for the future, a hope one needs very much when one's own life is close to the end and the negativities of life seem to darken the horizon. Oliver Sacks was like no other clinician or writer. He was drawn to the homes of the sick, the institutions of the most frail and disabled, the company of the unusual and the abnormal. He wanted to see humanity in its many variants and to do so in his own almost anachronistic way, face to face, over time, away from our burgeoning apparatus of computers and algorithms. And through his writing, he showed us what he saw. Sacks had asked me whether I'd read Forster's The Machine Stops. I hadn't, but his letter prompted me to. And I see why he was so drawn to it. It's about a world in which individuals live isolated in cells, fearful of self-reliance and direct experience, dependent on plate screens, instant messages, and the ministrations of an all-competent machine. Yet there's also a boy who, like Sacks, saw what was missing. The boy tells his mother, "The machine is much, but it is not everything. I see something like you in this plate, but I do not see you. I hear something like you through this telephone, but I do not hear you. That is why I want you to come. Pay me a visit so that we can meet face to face and talk about the hopes that are in my mind." Thank you.